Halo, halo, suaraku masuk. Oke, oke. Sorry, tadi sepertinya eh, ada error di audio. Maaf banget, mungkin aku ulangi lagi ya. Eh, Namaku Raka, aku dari Core Team DSC Activation dan di sini saya sebagai moderator. Sebelumnya aku ingatkan teman-teman untuk on cam dan pasang virtual background seperti kemarin-kemarin. Dan di chat sudah juga ada attendance form dan Q&A Slido seperti biasanya. Sekarang kita langsung aja kenalan dengan speaker kita hari ini yaitu Kak Farel Mahastra. Halo Kak Farel Mahastra.
Hello.
Halo. Nah, kakak ini merupakan software engineer di Remnote. Nah, apa kabarnya Kak Farel?
Ya, kalau boleh pakai bahasa Inggris ya. Jadi kalau boleh, if I can introduce myself, like I'm a software engineer at Remnote. Remnote is software for note taking and flashcards to help students study, things like that. And I joined the team last November, so November of 2022. And before that, I've had around like 3 years of experience working as a software engineer, everywhere from front end development, so mostly using React, React Native, a little bit of Flutter, um, which is partly what I'll be talking about today, and backend development as well. So just all across the stack. Yeah, and that's a bit about me.
Oke, oke. Thank you for your introduction. Eh, Oke, mungkin langsung aja ya. Waktu tempat saya persilahkan semuanya ke Kak Farel.
Okay, let me share my screen. Okay. Hello everybody. uh, so today I'll be presenting with Remnote. And let me just start. Okay, there you go. Okay, so today I will be talking about state management. There's a couple of assumptions here in this little presentation. So firstly, I assume that you have a basic understanding of Flutter and Dart, or if you use something similar like React and JavaScript, or just like anything similar in the front end. I'm assuming you already have Flutter installed in your machine, because I've seen a couple of the previous talks and there was a bunch of Flutter there as well as Git, which will be important for this because there's some examples that I put on GitHub. And if it turns out that any of this is not true, then you can just look at additional resources here where I put like links to download Git or install Flutter. But if you don't really have time for that right now, then you can probably do it after this talk. And if you have any trouble, you can probably just message me afterwards. I'll give everybody my contact information. Yeah, and another assumption is that you're okay with me explaining this in English. So I know that I'm supposed to sort of mix it up with English and Indonesian, but I have no idea how to explain any of this in Indonesian. So if I'm going too quickly, whether just from like a English language standpoint or just like I'm explaining things technically too quickly, then feel free to just chat and tell me to explain that again or just ask a question like anytime. Okay, so introduction. Uh, so yeah, I want to talk about like what state management is, because I want to sort of not make this too much about state management in Flutter specifically, but state management as like a general concept, but explained in how you implement it in Flutter, which that just seems a lot more informative. So state, this is like kind of a wishy-washy definition, but it's like a simple definition, which is that state is like the data or information that's being used or changed by your program. So here I gave an example, which is like in a program where you are incrementing a number by one each time it runs, the counter or the number that you're keeping track of that continually increases each time you run the program, that's an example of what you can call state. That's an example of the state of your program. It's a very broad definition, but I'll be more specific as I go on. And okay, so what does it mean to manage state? Because managing state and the outset just seems like dealing with normal variables, which is kind of true. I'll explain that later again. But the way I would define it is that, simply speaking, it's just ways or strategies to manipulate and retrieve your state. So in the example of like Flutter, this would be, for example, the provider package, which is an external package, but it could just be a built-in feature of the language, the library or framework in itself. So in React, this would be like the hooks. So like some hooks are for state management. So that's maybe all of them. But yeah, some of them are specifically for state management, like use state or use reducer. And in Flutter, sort of like the functions or the widgets that you care about are like stateful widgets, or maybe inherited widgets, which we'll talk about later, and the set state function. Or it doesn't need to be any of that. It can just be like a design pattern. And in a way, these packages or these built-in features are really just nicely packaged design patterns that you can use out of the box. And state management that I'm going to be talking about right now is specifically front-end state. Because as I mentioned before, like if you think of state as just the data or information that's being manipulated, being moved around, being changed, being retrieved, that could be anything. But right now, I think when people talk about state management, they talk about managing front-end state. And in this case, when I'm explaining how to do it in Flutter, it's definitely just front-end state. Yeah. Any questions there? Did I go too fast there? But okay, I have no idea how to check the questions, but I'll do it later. Okay, so why do we need it at all? Because as I mentioned before, like if state is just data that's being manipulated and retrieved, that just sounds like a regular program with variables. And it's true, like we technically don't need any state management packages, whether that be like in external packages or in the form of a UI library like React or in the form of a framework like Flutter. We technically don't need any of that to manage front-end state. So a simple example, which is like what a lot of people used to do back in the day, when during the early days of websites, is that they would just create an interactive website with regular JavaScript. So they would have the HTML, they would have the HTML to as the markup for the text, the CSS for the styling, and JavaScript for very simple interactions like I don't know, getting the values in a very like a rather complex form, let's say. And you can do that. You can just use regular JavaScript and manage your entire state that way with like regular variables. And then what you can do is that once you with those variables, if those variables change, then you can manually like write out the code to update different parts of the UI. You can do that. It just turns out that it's quite difficult, and it gets complicated very fast, which is why, for example, on top of JavaScript, I think early on people built jQuery, which is just like a nice little wrapper of like utility functions and stuff around JavaScript. And then later on, they had like much larger UI libraries or frameworks like React, Angular, Vue, and so forth. And I think you can think of Flutter as kind of being a variant of that, except instead of JavaScript, you're using Dart as the language. So yeah, like I said, you don't need state management really, but once you're building a large enough app, or even like a relatively small app that just has a lot of state in it, it gets complicated very quickly. So it's very it would be very unnecessarily difficult to not use state management in many sort of modern apps, let's say. So yeah, what exactly makes it complicated? Well, once you have like a lot of variables or you have a lot of state, we need to make sure that that we have to synchronize the state. So what that means is we need to make sure that the state is always up to date in the correct parts of the app. So the example I'm giving here is, for example, you have an app, and I don't know, it doesn't matter what the app is. Maybe it's like an e-commerce app, and it allows the user to change their username. So what should happen is that when your username is changed in the settings page or the settings screen, the username should be changed everywhere. This is kind of difficult to do if you're only using just no state management whatsoever, because you need to make sure that everything is changed at the same time and the correct parts of the app are changed. And you don't need to just do that for this username setting. You need to do that for everything where you have some information in your app that can change and you need to retrieve. So, you can imagine that gets quite complex very quickly. And another thing that we need to do is we need to handle re-rendering when the state changes, and only in the parts that use the state, ideally. So in the previous, when I talked about just creating an interactive website with vanilla JavaScript, handling re-rendering here is just updating the correct parts of the app when their state changes. That gets difficult and very complex very quickly. So this is typically built into UI libraries and frameworks, like React or Flutter. And besides that, it's very important for performance. So in React's case, they basically, it's like part of like the main functionality of React, that the re-rendering is just more efficient. It doesn't re-render the entire DOM when you change something. Like it has this virtual, it's kind of out of scope. It has this virtual DOM where they basically only update like the parts of the UI where the state changed. And that's very important for performance, because once you have a very complex app, with many moving parts, say like an e-commerce app or a dating app or anything, it can get very complex very quickly. And what that means is it'll probably be very slow if you're constantly re-rendering the entire app or large parts of the app that don't need to re-render necessarily all the time. So yeah, these are a couple of reasons why we might want to use state management to make our lives easier. But again, it's not super necessary. Like, it is possible to make like a modern app without any quote state management. And yeah, this is more pronounced with larger apps, and proper state management helps create a maintainable application. Because what's important to remember is that when you're creating a web app or a mobile app, you're typically not going to be working alone. And this becomes more true like the larger the app is. Maybe at university in some of your projects for your classes, or maybe some of your side projects, you might be used to working in very small teams, maybe only 2 to 3 people, or maybe alone. And that's certainly possible for a certain size of app, but like when your app becomes a lot more complicated, that's kind of not feasible, because coding or programming is typically a social activity, in 2023, which means that there's going to be a lot of people working on the app, and you need to make sure that the app is not too complex to work on, that it can still sort of fit in the individual developer's head. And this is another reason why we want to use state management, because when you're creating your own system to manage state and manually handle everything, it can not only get complicated for the machine itself, it can get complicated for the developers, which is, it might be worse, because then it makes it harder to build features, fix bugs, and so on. Okay, so enough talking. I would like to show you an example of what state management looks like in Flutter. And I think a good way to show that first is the default app that's created when you run Flutter create whatever, like let's call it counter. So the default app that's created here, okay, sorry. Yeah, so I've already run that. And this is what you get. Or you can try and run it yourself, but this is basically what you get, at least. It is on Linux. I don't know, it might have different folders for different operating systems. But the main part of this that's generated is this bit, which is just main.dart. And by the way, if you don't know, let me just try and run this really quickly. Oh, I don't know if you can see this, but yarn. Oh, sorry, I'm thinking about the wrong thing. Flutter run. Okay, and mine, let's try Chrome. Just wait a second for the app to load. So this is just a regular, the default app is just a counter app. So it shows like the basic scaffolding, and you can press a button to increment some counter. And it's a pretty good place to start when you're trying to look at, state management. Oh, okay. Yeah, when you're trying to think about state management in Flutter, it's a pretty good place to start. Oh no, it's not starting. Is there a reason why it's not starting? Let's try that again. Oh, does anyone have any questions from all of that? Just like while we wait for this to run. Oh, how do I look at questions? Oh, it ran. Okay, so I'm running like the Chrome version of this, but I'm showing it in a sort of like a fake mobile viewport, just because it's just easier to demonstrate that, because people might not have all like the different Android and iOS emulators on their machine, but most people probably have Chrome. So yeah, okay. So yeah, this is just what it does. It's just a button, and it just keeps track of. Can we zoom in? Oh, maybe it's better to. Okay. Yeah, this is all it does. It just keeps track of how many times you press the button, which, it sounds pretty simple, but looking at the code itself is pretty illustrative of how everything works in Flutter. So you probably already know this because you've been through a bunch of Flutter talks, but obviously it starts with like a main function and just runs the app, and the root of like the app is a stateless widget, which I'll explain later. You have the basic, your material app scaffolding here. You have a title, theme, and then your main page, just this. It's a stateful widget because we need to keep track of the counter, and you have the event handler here, and I suppose that's called when we press the button. Yeah, so this is just an example of how you do very basic state management in Flutter. You might ask, if it's just a variable that we're keeping track of, is just an int, then why do we need any of this set state stuff? And I think the comment here can explain it better than I can, which is that the call to set state tells the Flutter framework that something has changed, which causes it to rerun the build method below so that the display can reflect the updated values. If we change counter without calling set state, then the build method would not be called again, and so nothing would appear to happen. So what's like to oversimplify it, I think this is pretty much how it works. But to oversimplify it, yeah, this is what I meant by handling re-rendering when the state changes, because yes, it's technically just a number or an integer variable, but say if you're trying to implement this without all the functionality behind Flutter, say in like just regular JavaScript or regular Dart, then every time you increment this counter, you would need to get some reference to this text element, and you need to manually update that. You need to sort of get this text element somehow, or whatever wherever you're defining that text element. You need to get this text element manually. You probably need to get a reference to it, and you probably need to replace the text like manually each time with some function, as opposed to just relying on the rebuilding that Flutter does. So in this case, it's called a build function, but in React, it would just be the render function. I mean, the render method. Yeah, it's kind of very similar concepts. So this seems over-engineered, but like I said, once you have enough state, this is a very good idea. Because if without this functionality, this is probably the most important bit of, I think, in my opinion, all of Flutter, besides the cross-platform stuff. Without this functionality, you need to update the UI manually each time correctly for each piece of state that changes all the time. And you need to make sure that all the UI is synced to the state and all the state is up to date. And I think you can start to get an idea now of why that would be difficult. Okay, yeah. So let me just go back. That's just a brief summary of what the counter app looks like. So yeah, I mean, like I said, the counter app is super simple, but the way you manage the state, you need to be very careful with how you manage the state to avoid like the above problems that I mentioned before. But let's look at something that's slightly more complex. So let's think about a to-do app in Flutter. So previously, we only basically had a single screen and everything was pretty much defined in that screen. I mean, I think it was using some widgets from Material UI, but otherwise it's basically just one big widget, which is the screen or the page. And there was only one piece of state that we sort of care about. I mean, there's obviously more state underneath the hood, but there's only kind of one that we defined, which was just a counter. But if we think of a to-do app, like what kind of widgets will we have, first of all? So obviously you might have the basics, you have the scaffolding or the scaffold, maybe you have some other layout elements like padding or container. And then you might also have things like the app bar and the bottom navigation bar, which is fine. I mean, those are pretty much just using some pre-existing widgets. But then what else do we need? We need a screen for the to-do list itself. And we need some kind of form to input a to-do list. And we also need other forms, probably, maybe to update the to-do list, maybe some way to delete the individual to-do items. And we might want to add other screens, like maybe a settings screen, maybe you have a profile screen, maybe whatever you want. And that ends up being quite complicated for something as simple as a to-do list, which really is just the same functionality as like pen and paper. And within all of that, if you think of like what kind of state do we need there? Well, first of all, you need the to-do items. And that to-do item may come in the form of maybe just an object, or like, I don't know, a hash map, or yeah, I mean, let's just call it an object. And maybe that object will contain several keys. Maybe it'll have a title of the to-do item. Maybe it'll have a description. Maybe it'll have a due date. Maybe it'll have a priority level. Maybe you want to think about what category is this to-do item. Maybe it's a chore. Maybe it's something for university. Maybe it's something for work. Maybe it's something, something personal. Maybe like, I don't know, call your parents, or feed your cat. And that ends up being very complicated just in itself. But that's not all we need to keep track of. We need to keep track of what settings have been enabled. So if there are different user settings to enable or disable certain functionality in the app, we need to keep track of those. And obviously there's other stuff that you probably wouldn't think about, but you could still count them as state, which is, when you have a text input and you type in some value, we need to keep track of that. Sometimes it happens like quote automatically. So, in JavaScript or rather like in HTML, you technically don't need JavaScript to handle input elements, but sometimes you do. Sometimes you want to make it a quote controlled input. to do things with it and to make it easier to do things with it, like validation or things like that. We also need to keep track of whether or not something as simple as whether or not a form should be open. So if the form only opens, for example, when the user presses like the edit button or something, we need to keep track of that. We need to keep track of when it should be open, how it turns from closed to open, and we need to make sure that when our state says that it's open, that the UI shows it as open, and vice versa. You know, when the state shows it closed, it needs to be closed, and we need all of this to be synchronized with the UI, and we need to handle all of this. So, and this is just a to-do app. A to-do app that really doesn't have a lot of functionality. It's basically just a CRUD app, like a create, read, update, delete type app. But even then, it's a CRUD app with a data type that's very simple. It's typically just title, description, whatever. But if you think about more complex apps, like I mentioned before, maybe an e-commerce app, maybe a video streaming app, I don't know, then it becomes super complicated. And again, this is why we need something like state management. I will show you an example of a to-do app that like a super simple to-do app that I prepared for this talk, but we'll do it later. But for now, I want to talk about sort of the specifics of like how state management, well, not really specifics, but like an overview of how state management is done in Flutter. So there are roughly, I mean, sometimes people say there's 2 widgets, but there's kind of really 3. There's a stateless widget, meaning once you sort of create it, it's immutable. Their properties can't change. All values are final. This is directly from the documentation, which is great. You should read it. The way I think about it is like just a constant, whether that's being Dart or JavaScript. Like you need to create a new one. You can't. Oh, well, actually, I don't know if that's like that in JavaScript. But yeah, I mean, the point is like you can't manipulate it. It's immutable. If you want to change it, you need to create a new one with different properties. And there's a stateful widget, which is kind of the opposite of that. It's not immutable. This is where we maintain the state within Flutter, which might change during the lifetime of the widget. What that means is it'll change while you're using the app. And this is the widget that has access to set state, as I've shown earlier in the counter app demo. And then you have the inherited widget. This is kind of, I think this is kind of difficult to explain, but to oversimplify it, the point of inherited widget is to provide the state provide the states sort of globally to the widgets, and it handles the rebuilding of the state updates. And the reason that we might want to use the inherited widget is because while you can just use stateless and stateful widget all the time, this does lead to situations where React calls it prop drilling, meaning it can get kind of laborious or tedious to sort of pass down the state down to entire widget tree all the time when you need something, when you need some state that is very high up, or a lot of widgets require it, then you need to put it very high up, but then that also means you need to sort of pass it down to everything. And that can get complicated because it gets harder to track where the state is coming from. You know, it might be harder to debug because you don't even know what the flow looks like if you're new to the code base and things like that. So you just have this inherited widget that just passes down the state. You can kind of think of this as similar to like a React context, or kind of like Redux. So it's just a way of lifting the state up and making it available to whatever you define it to be available for. And yeah, I'll show you examples of how these are used. You already saw a couple examples of the first 2, but I'll show you some more examples. So I created a little to-do app, and you can, and by the way, I will share this entire thing afterwards, but for now I'll just go through it. So here I linked the different commits in this little app that I made. You can find it at github.com/. Okay, there you go. Yeah, I made this little repository, which is just a demo of the to-do app. And let me show you what it all looks like. So I already cloned the repository. It's in to-do. So yeah, I have a couple of commits here. The first is just setting up the boilerplate for Flutter. And then the most important ones are these three here, which is add buggy app, add correct app, and refactor provider. So I'm going to be showing you the first version of this app, which is intentionally buggy. So let me just check out that commit. Okay. Flutter run. Just wait a second once more. I think it's installing some dependencies. Now it's about to run. Yeah, so just while I wait for it to run, let me just sort of explain what those three commits were. So the first one that I'm about to show you is first try at creating a to-do app in Flutter, but it's intentionally broken to show you some of the problems you might encounter with state management in Flutter. The second commit is one where it's pretty much fixed. And the third one is where it's fixed, but it looks prettier because we're using the provider library. Okay, so this is the first one. Let me just do the same thing. Show it in a mobile viewport. So yeah, this is super simple. Oh, my cursor is lagging. So it just has these two pages as to-do and settings. The to-do is meant to just be like a list of to-do items, and settings. We'll look at that later. We can look at that now. So settings just has turn on dark mode. That's the only setting it has. So let's look at the plus button. Yeah, so what the plus button is supposed to do is just supposed to show like a little form with the title and description of the to-do. And the idea is that I wanna do something like, I don't know, feed my cat. And say that, I don't know, he likes the expensive cat food. I don't actually have a cat, but if I did, this might be a to-do that I would use or I would write. So let's try and create that. So now we have a to-do list item, and we try and select it, and then we can select it. And if I press that, it'll delete it. The problem is, if I try and go to settings now and go back, to-dos disappear. Let me just try that again. Feed my cat. Whiskas. Okay. Okay, so I mean, the deletion works, but for some reason, if we go to settings and go back, it just disappears completely. And I'm going to be explaining why. Okay, but before that, let me just go back. Okay. Oh wait, I wasn't done. Okay. So I'm looking at that. I am looking at that commit again. And this is the counter app. I'll close that. I'll show you what the to-do app looks like. So I've pretty much deleted everything except for just the web stuff, because I'm just want to demonstrate this on web. And just to give you like an outline of what this looks like, I have the usual main.dart, which is the entry point for the app. And I've just sort of haphazardly organized these in the screens folder and the widgets folder. The screens meaning sort of like the main screen widgets, and the widgets is just everything else. And this is what main.dart looks like. So it starts out pretty similar to the counter app. I'm just defining like a custom type, sort of custom class here called to do. It just has a title, a string, which is the title, and another string, which is the description, and then an optional selected property, which is what we're going to use for the selecting the to-dos. And we're running the app to do app, and it's just showing material app. I turned off the debug banner. And the home here is just a general screen component because, yeah, it's just a simple way to show it. And the screen component is a stateful widget where it basically handles the body of the screen, so like the contents of the screen, as well as handles sort of which item in the bottom navigation bar is active when we press it, sort of handles the tapping of that as well. And these are the actual screens. So list widget screens, cons to-do screen, and setting screen. So if you go to to-do screen, I mean, it looks okay at first glance. You have it's a stateful widget. The screen is a stateful widget. And within the state, there's like a list of to-dos, and you have some event handlers. So when you create a to-do, when you delete a to-do, or when you select a to-do, and this is just showing the to-do list in a list view. Yeah, and this is the main build function where we're showing a custom app bar. We're just rendering the body that way. And we have the floating action button, very similar to the counter app. And here I'm using show modal bottom sheet for the to-do form that you saw, where we enter the title and description. So yeah, I mean, that looks all right. And if we go to settings, it's a bit shorter. Well, it's a lot shorter, really. And the state here is dark mode enabled. And when we press the switch, we expect dark mode enabled to be true. Now the question is, I haven't actually implemented dark mode here, but I just put it there, and it wouldn't work anyway. And I'll explain why. So here I'm keeping the state in to-do.dart. It's right here. But when we go to settings, this doesn't exist anymore because it's kept in to-do screen. So once we build another widget, or in this case, the setting screen widget, this doesn't persist. And in order to make it persist in Flutter, you would want to bring the state up. Because right now, if you think of it as like a tree where this to-do app is kind of like the top of the tree, and then maybe below it is this material app screen stuff. From screen, it branches out into to-do screen and setting screen. And the way it's done right now, whenever one of these is built, the other one, the state there doesn't persist. So what do we do? Well, one thing we could do is that instead of keeping the to-dos in to-do screen state, and instead of keeping dark mode enabled in setting screen state, we can just bring it up. And this works. We can just bring it up. Maybe instead of storing the state there, we can maybe store the state here. Because obviously the selected index stuff works. Like it works no matter what which screen we go to. Because this bit doesn't disappear. We don't, it's always built. It's always there, no matter which screen we go to. So we could just put the to-dos here. We could put dark mode enabled here. We can just do stuff with it. We can maybe pass it down. So no matter what happens in the to-do screen or the settings screen, it'll be kept here and it'll be fine. We can do that. But maybe for dark mode, we might want to bring it higher up even. We want to bring it here to main.dart. Maybe you want to, turn this into a stateful widget somehow and keep the dark mode enabled flag there. And maybe we can use it here in material app. There's like a parameter here called theme mode, dark theme, where we can sort of define what the dark theme looks like. And we can also define what the current theme mode is. So you can imagine if dark mode is enabled, there's other ways to do this, but you can imagine that, when dark mode is enabled, we can sort of switch the theme mode. And in that way, we can enable dark mode. So now, in order to fix that issue, you have moved your state to different places. So one is here, and you basically have to, if you're just doing it the quick way, you can turn this to stateful widget, put dark mode enabled there, and pass it down to screen. And then from screen, you pass it down to setting screen. And then in setting screen, you might do something with it, Plus, you actually have to handle the variable here. Don't forget that. And as for the to-dos, we're moving it here, and you might either have to move the event handlers here, maybe, or maybe pass those event handlers down. The point is, it gets very complex, and that's just like 2 bits of state that we care about. It gets very complex because now it's all over the place just to make the app work. And it's kind of unclear once you do that, which parts of the which widgets will rebuild, what will the impact be on performance, or if someone new comes into this project and they sort of read it, like, can they understand it very quickly? My guess is no. So we might want to try something different. And for that, let me now go back to, okay, let's not use that. Okay, let's try that. Okay, so that was the buggy app. Let's go to the correct app, or the hopefully correct app. Okay, and then we go Flutter. So as you're about to see, okay, let's just maybe take, okay, is it gonna load fast? Might not. As you're about to see, we did something similar, which is that we're still lifting the state up, but instead of just keeping it in a regular stateful widget, we're using inherited widget here. And I guess the main point of that, I mean, you might ask, like, what's the point? It's like the same thing. Passing down the state is not that difficult because there's only like 2 layers of abstraction from the main app widget. So what's the point? And I'll go into that later, but right now it's loaded, so I'll just show how it works now. So I'll do the same thing. I'll do feed my cat. Feed my cat good food. And I'll create it. And I'll go to settings again. And hopefully this time, yeah, now it shows up. And I can still do the same things. And plus now, dark mode works as well. And of course, dark mode still works when you go to the other screen. And we can turn off again. So yeah, now our simple little app works. And I'll explain why. So let's go back to main.dart. So there's a couple differences here. Here, we've added these containers. So the most important bit is here, inherited state container extends inherited widget. And the basic idea here is that you can't really manipulate state directly within inherited widget, as far as I know. So we kind of have to wrap it with stateful widget. And in that way, we're working in all the state in this thing and state container state, which is not a great name, but it is what it is. And we're keeping it here. It's all in one place. We have to-dos, just like before, and we have dark mode enabled equals false, which is the default value. And we've moved all our event handlers here, and including toggle dark mode. And we're just sort of passing it down. And how we're passing it down is here. So the entire app now has access to that state. Yeah. So one example of how we're using dark mode enabled is we're just using state container.of context dot dark mode enabled. And if it's enabled, we enable theme mode.dark, otherwise theme mode.light. And if you want to look at how we're actually using that, so yeah, this is the new setting screen stuff. So it's kind of the same stuff. We're still using that variable, except we're getting it from state container. And instead of having our event handler here, we're just using the one in state container, which is toggle dark mode. So it's sort of manipulating the state high above without having to explicitly pass it down to setting screen. Setting screen still looks the same. Same thing with to-do, kind of doing basically the same thing. We're just using the event handlers from state container, and we're using the to-dos stuff from state container. So here's an example where we're checking whether or not the to-do list is empty. And what we've done is we've now fixed that entire bug without having to put this through all the widgets that don't necessarily need it. No, we're just passing it down for the sake of passing it down to the correct widget down below the tree. That's an example of how you might use inherited widget to avoid a situation like that. This bit is a little complicated. There's a lot of boilerplate, and that's actually something quite. I mean, it is quite annoying because there's a lot of things to write, and you don't know what these things mean. Like depend on inherited widget of exact type, inherited state container. It's quite hard to read, and there's a lot to write, and there's a lot to get wrong. There's a lot of. It looks like there's a lot of Googling to Stack Overflow to get things right. And instead of doing this, we might want to use something called the provider library. So let me just go back here for a bit, or the provider package rather. So the provider package is an external package, and I'm just opening the page here. It says it's a wrapper around inherited widget. So it's kind of like what we're doing, but it just makes it easier to write, and it does some other things, which are pretty good. So it's not just a wrapper around inherited widget, and it makes things easier to write, or easier to write and easier to read, which is always a good thing. And I will show you what that looks like. So let's just go to the latest version of the repository. Let's run that as well. Is it going to run? Well, I mean, I could probably skip that. Well, to make it short, it basically looks the exact same as the previous version of the app, except if we now look at main.dart, all that inherited widget stuff is gone. We now just have this thing. We just pass down a change notifier provider. This is one way to use it. There's other ways to use it, but this is one way. We just pass down a change notifier provider. We pass in our sort of state widget, and we pass in our actual app widget. And in the state widget, where we previously had a stateful widget, and we had like the state of the stateful widget, and then we had an inherited widget, we now just have one class which extends change notifier from the provider package library or package. And it's kind of similar stuff. It's also holding to-dos. It's also holding dark mode enabled. And we're adding the to-dos here. And once we add the to-dos here, we notify listeners. So what that means is like in some places here. Okay, so this is how you use it. Here, this is an example of how to use it in the to-do screen. We go provider.of to-do app state context.todos. And in here, I guess one way to put it is that it's listening to whether or not the state has changed, and it updates if it has. But sometimes we don't want to listen to whether or not the state has changed. So an example is, where is it? So basically the event handlers, like we don't listen for whether or not the event handlers change. Yeah, here you go. Because they don't change. And it actually throws an error if you try and make it listen for the event handler change. And yeah, that's what notify listeners is for, is to update that. And then we have the other event handlers here, and we have toggle dark mode, and it's all that. It's just, this is all you need to pass down the state to your entire app without all that boilerplate. There's some other extra features that we're not going into, but yeah, I mean, that's pretty good, I think. Yeah, I think that's the explanation for the to-do app. We're going through the code a little bit. So now I want everybody to sort of do this little exercise. I'll share this document. I want you to go to this repository in my GitHub account, which is what I've just shown you. And there's some stuff in the notes here. Oh, yeah, there's some stuff in the notes here that might be interesting. I mean, you don't actually have to do this now, but it's just something to think about. So within all of that, you might think about like, what else can we add? And how can we try and manage the new state if you have new state? Some examples is validating to-do form. So previously, if you try to enter an empty title and description, it would just do it. It would just create that, which is not good probably. You might want to ensure that it's at least not empty. You might want to figure out how to update an individual to-do item, because previously we only had an add and a delete and a read, but no update. So how do you do that? Like what kind of state do you need to keep track of? Maybe you need to add a new form, or maybe somehow you can reuse the existing one. So yeah, there's a couple things to think about there. And maybe you also want to add categorizing to-dos. So like I mentioned previously, maybe you want to put them in these little boxes like chores or work or personal or study. So how do you do that? So because right now we only have sort of an array of objects, and that's just your entire to-do list. So how do you split that up in a way where it's fast, where it makes sense, where it's easy to work with, into different categories? By the way, this is all just front-end stuff. Obviously, like the real app, you would probably want to save this somewhere in a server somewhere, or at the very least, you want to be able to persist this locally somehow, maybe on the whether on your phone or whether on the website. And some other questions to ask: how can we reduce code duplication? Because if you look through the repository, there is quite a bit of code duplication. So for example, each screen defines its own app bar completely. It also sort of rebuilds its own body, I think. So how can you get rid of that? And where else in the app can you think of reducing code duplication? Which is always a good thing, I think. Another question, how can we optimize the state management here to limit unnecessary rebuilds? I haven't actually looked into it because I think you might have to profile it or something. But there's probably a lot of parts in that app where widgets are rebuilding when they don't need to be. And it might just be because I've written it badly. So, it's good to think about how do you optimize the state management here to limit unnecessary rebuilds. And maybe the last couple of questions is, how else can we structure the app directory? Or is the naming of the widgets idiomatic? This isn't really important for state management, but it's something always worth thinking about. Like, are you structuring your project in a nice way? Because when you're working on side projects and stuff, it's kind of easy to get carried away with your own way of doing things. So yeah, these are all good questions to ask, and not just for Flutter, but in general for any sort of front-end UI state management work. These are fairly good questions to ask, and are pretty valid for every other way of state management in every other UI library, really. And some additional resources, like I showed before, is how to download Git, how to install Flutter, a simple tutorial for app state management, which I believe also uses the provider library. And something that I didn't cover today, because it just seems a little out of scope, is using MVC, or Model View Controller, design pattern in Flutter, as well as other design patterns. Yeah, I mean, you can look at these resources later. Let me just share this super quickly. Okay. Oh, everyone. All right. So I think that is it for my presentation. Thank you for listening. I'm sure I went too quick in many places, but feel free to ask me questions. Believe it or not, I also speak Indonesian, so feel free to ask me in Indonesian as well. Although I might not respond in Indonesian. Yeah. I don't think we can hear you again. Or is it just me?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, let me stop sharing. Okay.
Thank you very much Kak Farel untuk semua materinya. Mungkin kita langsung lanjut aja ke selanjutnya yaitu Q&A. Technical mungkin bisa dikasih slide-nya. Jadi aku lihat udah ada satu pertanyaan. Mungkin langsung aja ya saya bacakan. Out of topic, can you tell us your story? How do you land your first job from fresh grads until now?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I'm 22 now. I graduated in 2018. So it kind of starts from there. So after high school, I graduated high school in 2018. I took a gap year. I decided to take a gap year because I didn't get into the universities I wanted to. I took a gap year and I decided to do a couple internships. They weren't software related. I think the first one was just, I was called an analyst intern. But I was already interested in software engineering or just programming for a while. Like I had computer science classes in high school. Oh yeah, by the way, I'm not a fresh grad. I'm still working on my degree. I'm probably gonna graduate not too far ahead of like all of you. And okay, yeah, back to my point. I got my first software engineering internship just by sending an email. I just sent emails to a lot of startups, and I'm grateful that one of them responded and gave me an internship. After I interviewed and did the coding test and all that. And ever since then, I've just sort of been working full time. I started working mostly remotely in mid 2019. The first one was a local, kind of a local sort of Southeast Asia based startup, but it was partly remote. And after that, I worked in more fully distributed remote companies, and most recently that's remote. Yeah. Is there anything else you want me to elaborate on? I think that's it. Not much to, yeah.
Quite interesting story actually. So you're not graduated yet, but you're
No.
okay.
I have a high school degree and that's it.
I see. But
Yeah.
you have a work at
High school degree, diploma, high school
remote.
diploma. Yeah, but I work at remote. I find that software engineering is one of those fields where there are a lot more software engineering is a lot more forgiving field. People with you might say like not the right credentials. Because I think there's a lot of fields where they care a lot about where you went to university, or even like the kind of certificates you've had, or like I don't know, the competitions you've won, or things like that, or maybe your connections and things like that. And a lot of and these things somewhat matter. They still kind of matter when you're applying for software engineering roles, but I think not nearly as much as a lot of other roles. I think what matters most is you're able to program, obviously. You're able to work well with other developers in the team, and ideally you have some public portfolio of work that you can show. Yeah, that's it. I mean, that's like how you get hired, I suppose. Oh, and like you typically need to pass these coding interviews, so it's worth preparing for them a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody's ever asked about whether or not I have a degree. I think they pretty much ask, are you still doing your degree? Because that's relevant, as in because I need to spend time outside of work to do university stuff. So that's a relevant question, but mostly just for the time management bit, like not the actual degree, I think. Yeah, anything else from that question? I can answer that one.
Okay, I see.
Okay, maybe I'll just go through them really quickly. Oh, does it take a lot of memory? Well, depends. I think obviously once you're using these state management libraries or packages, you're adding a lot of overhead. So that's like code that didn't exist before. Now you're using it, so now it exists. So technically, you would use the least amount of memory if you just have no state management whatsoever. But yeah, whenever you're storing stuff and you're manipulating this stuff and you're checking whether or not it re-renders, stuff like that, yeah, it's going to take some memory, but I don't know what a lot means. I don't know. I mean, maybe depends on your app. If you have a very large app and your state management isn't worked on properly, then yeah, it may take a lot of memory. Just because you might be re-rendering things when you don't need to, or you might be storing state that you don't need to, or there might be a memory leak somewhere. So yeah, I mean, it really depends. Okay. Out of topic, as a software engineer, what's your opinion about artificial intelligence and big data? I don't really know much about big data. I just know it's like data that's big. But as for artificial intelligence, it's actually kind of an interest of mine. It's why I joined Remnote. I mean, I don't work on AI at Remnote, but sort of earlier this year, I was very interested in machine learning and AI stuff. And I decided to sort of try and learn all of that by myself. And it just ended up being a lot of information. So I needed a note-taking app, and I found a note-taking app that I really liked, which is Remnote. So I applied. But yeah, it's a big interest of mine, and I do eventually want to work a little bit more in with artificial intelligence or machine learning in the future, definitely. As the one who's already had experience in industry, do you find any fields that are also interesting other than software engineers? Well, obviously I haven't worked in many fields, just software engineering, so I don't know how much my opinion matters here. But I do find a lot of other fields definitely interesting. And I would work in those other fields if I felt I had, I was good at it. So I found a lot of things interesting, being a writer, working at an advertising agency sounds pretty interesting, or I don't know, working in finance. Plenty of roles are interesting. Do you think ChatGPT could replace developers? I've actually been thinking about this for sort of the past year, ever since, or past year, 2020, 2021, I guess. Yeah, I guess that was around when GPT-3 was released. And with GitHub Copilot as well. Whether or not I can replace developers, well, the real answer is I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. I've heard a lot of good arguments for it. I've heard a lot of good arguments against it. So for example, one of the arguments against it is that your main job as a developer is not to write code. It's to sort of work together with others in order to sort of understand kind of vague software requirements and translate it into a working product. Like the code is just incidental. That's one argument I've heard. Another is that even if you make an individual developer 100x more productive, that doesn't mean there's going to be less jobs. It just means there's more software to write, because there's always more software to write. So it won't really replace anybody. But I've also heard some pretty good arguments for it, which is, at a certain rate of improvement, we might not be able to anticipate how good let's say a version of GitHub Copilot in the future becomes. So we don't really know. My answer is I don't know, but I think pretty good universal advice is just be familiar with these. I mean, it's good that you know what ChatGPT is, because I don't think a lot of people know yet what ChatGPT is, even though it's I think one of the more popular releases from OpenAI. It's good that you know what that is. So definitely learn to use these tools, especially GitHub Copilot. And yeah, I mean, there's not much. I don't know the future. So, okay, sorry if it's a bit vague, but how would you tell that a state? I can't read the. Okay, maybe I need to minimize this. Sorry, my bad. Oh. How would you tell that a stateful program is not optimized correctly, and what are the best ways to optimize your code? Yeah, that's a good question. It's kind of different. I'm not too familiar with how it's done for mobile apps, but in the case of web apps, which is like what I mostly work on. Whether it's not optimized correctly, well, sometimes you can just tell because it's slow. Like subjectively, you know that it's slow. But sometimes you might not, the hits to performance might not be, big enough that, you don't really notice it subjectively, but you still care about it. In that case, you would use something like a profiler. So for example, Chrome has a profiler for measuring like the performance of a web app. You can just press record and do something in the website, and it'll sort of tell you all of the things that happened during that recording period, whether that be rendering something or running some function, and then you can see from there. There's like very specific events that happen, and that's a good place to start. I know React has its, like the React DevTools extension has its own profiler, but I'm not too familiar with how it's done in Flutter. As I don't use Flutter in my day-to-day work, but I just kind of know it a little bit. What are the common mistakes when using inherited widgets or provider? I don't know what the common mistakes are. I guess the common mistake, I mean, there might be more that I can't think of, but I think one common mistake with anything that's sort of similar to provider or inherited widget, which is like I mentioned, like Redux or React Context, maybe one mistake is just to keep all your state there. I mean, it sounds convenient to keep all your state there, but then you kind of run into the same problem as not using state management at all, because you have all your state in one place, and now you have to figure out like which part of the app uses this part of the state, and like how are we sure that we're not manipulating the incorrect parts, the incorrect state for different parts of that. So I guess there are benefits to not keeping your state too global. I think that's one criticism that people have of something like Redux, which is that it's actually good to keep your state as local as it needs to be. Yeah, I guess that's one common mistake, just keeping everything in there. Sometimes it doesn't need to be in there. Sometimes, like for example, if you want to keep track of some text input value or something that only shows up in one form, then yeah, keep your state there. Like don't move it. Don't make it available for the whole app or whatever. I know, and also you don't need to define like a single provider, just like how in React, you don't need to use a single big reducer. So you can sort of segment your state better that way. But yeah, I guess that's one thing, keeping your state too global. Anything else? Kind of curious, where do you learn coding, website courses, or anything else? Well, like I mentioned, I had computer, in high school, I was able to choose my courses. And one of the courses that I chose was computer science. They didn't teach us too much. I already knew programming like before then, but I didn't get into it really seriously. But I guess in high school, I was taught a little bit more programming, like specifically just object-oriented Java stuff. But as for how I've learned like the current skills I use day to day, those are, I don't know how to describe. I mean, sometimes I watch a video, but nowadays it's a lot quicker just to read documentation. Yeah, I mean, if you're my advice is that if you want to learn coding in general, is never start with things to learn, and then build something at the end. Always start with something to build, and then you'll learn how to do it. I mean, there's downsides to this. Like we don't want to always be in a just-in-time learning mode, but I think it's a pretty quick way to learn. Like for example, if you want to build a to-do app, then yeah, first you decide you want to build a to-do app, and then you work your way backwards to figure out how to do that, as opposed to going through the entire Flutter documentation, going through the entire, I don't know, Firebase documentation, whatever, and then writing your first line of code. I think it should be the other way around. That's how I've done it, at least.
Okay, so learning by doing, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's all for the question. Thank you very much, Kak Farel. Anything else you want to add?
I think that's it. Oh, if anybody would like a discount code to Remnote, hit me up. I'll send everybody my contact information later. That's it. Thank you for having me.
Oke, mungkin aku balik ke bahasa Indonesia. Nah, nggak kerasa kita sudah ada di penghujung penghujung learning session siang ini. Thank you very much Kak Farel one more time selaku speaker kita hari ini. Thank you juga semuanya sudah hadir di learning session kali ini. Mungkin sebelum ditutup kita bakal dokumentasi dulu, semuanya diharapkan untuk bisa on cam. Yuk, on cam dan pasang VBG-nya juga. Mantap. Yuk. Mungkin technical bisa ambil alih untuk documentation-nya.
Alright, one moment. Ayo teman-teman, kita mau ada sesi dokumentasi, jadi boleh langsung on cam dan pakai virtual background-nya ya. Bakal aku tunggu sekitar 20 detik kali ya, buat teman-teman prepare. Alright, aku take screenshot ya. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Oke, sip. Thank you guys.
Oke, thank you Ramzi udah dokumentasi. Kemudian jangan lupa untuk isi form presensi yang ada di kolom chat untuk kalian member. Dan juga nanti ada homework yang dari akad di Google Classroom seperti biasa. Jangan lupa juga hadir di learning session selanjutnya. Saya mohon maaf jika ada kata-kata yang kurang pantas dan menyinggung. Saya Raka, pamit undur diri. See you in the next class, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, thank you semuanya.